How do you think, and perhaps Peter, following on from your presentation there, how do you think mobility as a service could play a role in promoting modal shift to more active forms of transport in the future?
What it's attempting to do is to provide a complete set of information about what's available by different modes of transport, and how long it will take, the times, and the cost and so on. I guess the question is how you package that information and how you show it. So, for example, traditionally we might just focus on time and cost, maybe if we show calories or whatever as well. So in a sense we're trying to give people a broader idea of what the implications, or maybe in terms of the amount of pollution or CO2 that later it will generate. So I think the way we present it and show the consequences of it. Oh, sorry. All right. So the way we present it and show the consequences, I think, could be. All right. Could be quite significant. And I think the idea of nudge and so on is around, but I think the extent to which we might try and incorporate those into the information we go out as mobility as a service, I think hasn't really been studied very much yet.
Do you think mobility as a service has a place in cities like Copenhagen?
Tricky, huh? I think that there are a lot of possibilities in the future to explore, but I think that Peter provided a good insight into also how we should be technology fed, rather than led. So I think that there are some challenges around if everyone can follow their strongest burning wishes in terms of getting the car to pick them up, to drive them to work. I think that it puts enormous pressure on the city to cope with it. So I think a city like Copenhagen definitely would have to put out some policies or some thinking around how to control it or how to deal with it.
We know that for journeys of up to a mile in length, about 3/4 of people will walk all the way, and that has not changed very much in the last 40 years. Once you get beyond a mile, the proportion of people who walk goes right down. The drop-off in walking we've seen in this country is not a change in modal split. It's that the number of journeys under a mile have halved in about the last 30 years. So what's really critical is having destinations to walk to within about a mile. How long is it going to take to change cities to that sort of mixed use and higher densities that make them walkable for most journeys?
One of the things that fascinates me about Paris is the number of bread shops. And why do they have such a large number of bread shops? Well, there are two reasons. One is that the price is controlled, so bread is essentially cheap. And the other is that the content of bread is controlled, so that they can't have preservative. And therefore, and because the French diet is one of actually eating bread with their meals, they buy bread 3, 4, 5 times a day. And therefore they tend to walk to bread shops. Even the French car-loving public walks to the bread shop. And the thing we've been looking at in Latin America is actually to figure out what is it that people would like to do every day that actually would be a walkable thing to do. And then can we actually then use that knowledge to tell us what kind of things do we put in various local communities that will enable them to do that. So I think my approach to your question is actually find out what people would walk to, or what people would want to do a lot, put that within whatever that distance is, if it's a mile, and then they will walk. And generally where that's happened, we do see that. So I think, I actually don't like mobility as a service, I have to say, because I think it's actually hitting the wrong button. To me, what's important is, but it doesn't sound so good as an acronym, is accessibility as a service. It's actually what you're going to do at the end of the journey that we need to make accessible, and that's where the service is. And how we can actually make that accessible with the least use of mechanical, especially motorized assistance, the better. And so I think that means you have to figure out what it is. And those things that we might want within that short distance may be different for different places, different communities, different cultures, and so on. But that's not so difficult. So I think having to think about what is going to be at the end of that journey is important.
There is a lot more talk now about trying to have more denser settlements. Unfortunately, what's happening, although at the moment the population generally in the UK anyway is moving into, more of it's moving into the cities. Most of the house building is actually going in the rural and suburban areas. So, that's a big issue, I think, about whether the concern about building more houses will actually not take into account the sort of things we're talking about.
Mike Walter from the Institutions of Transportation Professional. A question for Henriette. Copenhagen certainly sounds like a success story when it comes to encouraging cycling and walking. Whereas in UK cities, we're probably, it's fair to say, a little way behind. What advice do you have for professionals in the UK who would like to emulate the Danish way, but maybe struggling to win the argument for more support or for more money for sustainable transport infrastructure?
What has been realized in Copenhagen just within the last 10 years is how to put all the different agendas, how all the different agendas can come together, so that we look at how can we get more value out of the climate adaptation projects we're doing, how can we get more value out of the investments in health, and that we start to look across the board instead of having isolated buckets of money dedicated for specific things. And I think it's back to Andreas's point around don't just look at the highways, but look at the complete picture, right? So how can we make all those buckets of money come together so that we start achieving better results across the board through the investments we're doing? And that's very much an experience or a learning from Copenhagen that bicycling is everybody's project. Not just the transport department, but it's everybody's project.
David Davis from PACT's Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety. Peter, you said we should be technology-fed, not technology-led. But how do you think we can get to that point in the UK? I mean, I say that because this government is not famous for consulting on transport strategy or developing transport. It's very strong on infrastructure investment, but not very much on strategy. In relation to autonomous vehicles, the consultations have been very much about technical development, safety, those sort of aspects which are important. But I mean, I wonder if we're at a stage yet where we can have a meaningful discussion about what we want out of these things, or that's still something for the future. We have to work out the technology first. Can you offer any advice?
I think the answer really comes in the cities. I mean, Ben Powden might want to say something about TfL, but I think clearly in rural areas, in a sense, the thing will sort itself out, I think, one way or the other. But in cities, it's a question of whether we want to... I mean, one of the basic questions is, will people still buy cars, but they'll be autonomous, in which case the markets will grow because younger, older people could have cars if they could afford them? Or will people give up owning cars, which is what seems to be suggested? I'm not sure I agree with that, and we'll have more collective transport, which could be more efficient. But certainly there are some... I mean, Paris is a good example where the deputy mayor has said, right, this is, Paris, we're moving towards a more livable city, we're reducing traffic, etc., and that's our policy and that's our vision. Anybody wants to come and help us with that, you're welcome. If not, you're not welcome. And I think it probably will come to some extent down at the city level about what the regulations are. And it's very easy, we hear lots of advice. I'm not saying they're not a good thing in many ways, but oh well, we won't need as many parking spaces because they can drop you off. Yes, but that means they'll be travelling up and down the road network. It's not a win-win situation. It's just, and I don't think these things have been fully thought through. But I think the cities are very aware, in a sense, and I think that's where the pressure will come from, not from national government.
I think if we are not careful, technology will lead the way we live, and it should be the other way around, as Peter said. We are in a very good place in time to prepare ourselves for the onslaught of this fantastic invention that we are all told about, that it's coming and it will come and dominate our lives. I haven't got a view as to whether it's going to be good or bad. I certainly haven't heard a convincing argument that it will make things better for us. And unless we introduce good regulations now, it will completely take over our lives. In 20 years' time, we will be discussing exactly the same problems and issues that we are discussing now, except that it will be with automated vehicles rather than manual. And 10 years ago, I didn't even know that I needed to have an iPad, but this guy, Steve Jobs, said, yes, here it is, Andreas, have it. So I've got it now. If we are not careful, the same will happen with automated vehicles, and I can see them dominating city lives, and it will be exactly the opposite to what all of us here today would wish for.
I have a question for Nick. I thought your presentation was fascinating, but I also think we probably know more than you were, I think, implying about the intersection between psychology and transport and city design. So Jan Gehl's first book in 1974, Life Between Buildings, pointed out, for example, that we have brilliant 180-degree vision in the horizontal plane, almost none at all above about the first story, because we evolved, as you said, to look across the van. So I just want to check whether you think that the problem is, and actually most good urban design is informed by those sorts of fundamental principles about how we interact with the environment. I just want to check whether you think the problem is that we don't know enough, or that we don't apply what we know to how we actually design cities and the transport systems that they use.
There's a bit more of a hardwired response that goes before, if you like, the conscious psychology kicks in. So that sense of how we respond, for example, to an event, somebody walking along the road while you're driving a car, for example, you will be responding to that pre-consciously much more than you actually realise, obviously, because it's pre-conscious. So, and your driving responses are going to be driven by those pre-conscious stimuli. And that means that we need to be designing for those. And that was really, I think, the issue there. And that actually becomes very important for autonomous vehicles, because the autonomous vehicle might react to the pedestrian crossing in front of them in the roadway, but actually the human driver will actually have been pre-consciously reacting to them long before that. And maybe we need to be looking much more at the number of accidents that do not happen rather than the ones that do, in the sense of how you're actually going to maintain that level of success with a much, much less effective capacity to deal with it. So I think the psychology angle, I think, is well done. I think we are learning very, very basic things around the deep brain navigation, and that is different from the sort of cognitive navigation. So the if you like, the kind of navigation process that Legible London uses is very conscious. But actually there is a much deeper navigational strand, which is driving, and we tend not to think about that. When you do see people using that is when they have dementia, and the superior cognitive processes are beginning to fade. The deep one is still there, and we're looking at whether that is one of the drivers for people with dementia wandering. So that actually they're not wandering; they're actually following some path. And if we can understand that process, we could understand that. So I think getting that understanding of the hardwiring part of the brain work, because I think that gives us real opportunities for how we can actually design better interactions for people in the kind of way in which we interact with other people and with the environment is what that's about.
Martina Juvara, I'm a master planner, and I agree, or I'm delighted to hear from Peter and Andreas that the urgency now is to discuss what kind of city we want before the technology kicks in. Why the car was so successful? It was successful because it was promoted as a business, was sold individually. And while governments take a long time to plan an airport, plan a tramway, cars can move. They don't need a lot of space. They need a very basic infrastructure by comparisons. And automated cars will take our lives like wildfire. There is no doubt. You know, the marketing is already well on. So we need to have that discussion, but also focus very much on what do we need to do now to prepare, to be ready. How can we make sure that the people that started to enjoy cycling don't drop the cycling because something else has come? And while we are all in agreement that places are important and they are successful, and all the places that have been created in London or all the other cities in the UK have been successful, how can we ensure that that's still the vision that we all hang on to? And I think that from a neurological point of view or from a practical point of view, but that discussion needs to be there now, and we need to prepare, because the marketing will take over before we know it.
A lot of the initiatives now are coming from the private sector, whether it's new mobility services or whether it's smartphones or whatever. And I think there's a distinction between, if you like, products that are sold to consumers that benefit the consumer individually, as opposed to whether there are aggregate effects that actually are disbenefits. Now, I was going to say with a smartphone, on the whole, people buy them because they want them, they then contact other people, and you end up with a system that people generally feel is beneficial. Although in the last couple of years, I think pedestrian accident rates have gone up, and I think part of the feeling is people are so busy looking at the phone, they're not. So that's potentially a negative effect. But on the whole, things like that are probably positive. I mean, clearly, when cars first came along, for each individual, it was freedom, etc., etc. But when you put a load of cars together, you end up with congestion, pollution, potentially danger, etc. And so I think the question is, for what sort of technology developments, which let's say they're being introduced mainly for the benefit of customers, in what cases do those collective customer use still lead to a benefit, or in what cases would the collective use actually lead to a disbenefit? So in that latter case, what's best for citizens is not necessarily the same as what's best for individual customers. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to think out and think about.
I did a lot of work in a city called Medellin in Colombia. And Medellin was very famous in the 1990s for being the murder capital of the world and drug gangs and all the rest of it. And in 2016, it won the Lee Kuan Yew Prize for being the world's sustainable city. How do you change from the one to the other in one generation? That's a massive, very, very rapid change. And there's a long story, which I won't go into, but the interesting thing, I think, the point I wanted to draw out of that, which follows from what Peter was saying, was they were lucky they had a mayor who sort of realised that the answer to this problem was the first thing you had to do was to get the people to love the city. And to get the people to love the city, they had to love each other. They had to trust each other. And this was a city where, walking down the road, the probability of you being shot was extremely high. And therefore, trusting other people on the street was a massive thing to do. So the first thing they did was to get people to learn to trust each other, and they started that by encouraging positive responses to good behaviour. So if somebody stopped their car so that you could cross the road, that would be a good piece of behaviour. So they had gloves with thumbs, and you give them a thumbs up, and so on. And it sounds really, really trivial and basic, but what they had to do, it was so difficult, they had to start with that process. But I think that interesting thing of getting the people, build the city as the people, and the stuff that goes around the city, whether it's the metro or the other stuff that they've done in that city, that all goes around the people. And getting the people to believe in themselves and each other first was the first thing to do. So we took that as a sort of starting point and worked with cities in Latin America to get them to figure out what the vision for that city was, given that kind of model. And I mean, I can remember we went to one city and I asked them what their vision for the city was, and the vision for the city was to have more parking. And why do you want more parking? Well, because we want it to be more convenient. But we could actually change by changing their perspective from how do I fix it for parking cars to how do we actually make people actually trust each other, have a better life. They then turn that round into being, well, we would like to have more trees, we'd like to have more green and all that sort of stuff. And suddenly realise you can't have the parking because the trees are going to occupy what they were thinking of being as parking spaces. So I think you're absolutely right. You have to get that picture of what you want the city to be, but we're really not very good at asking it. And we're even worse at listening to what the answers might be and figuring out and having that mature discussion where competing and differing visions of what that city might be, how we actually get those to come together. Medellin had the big advantage that it had a really, really bad situation to come out of. And I've been trying to figure out how you can get the kind of result that you got in Medellin without having the drug wars and the murders first, because that was clearly a useful thing in that sense. So to me, I think it's a really, really core question. And before we do anything else, we should be asking that kind of question.
Whenever I see photographs of people cycling in Copenhagen, or when I visited Aalborg a number of years ago, actually, one of the things that always strikes me is how casual people are dressed when they're cycling, how the bicycles are quite ordinary bicycles, whereas in this country it's what I call a very lycra-led activity. So I'm actually wondering whether there's any evidence to suggest that workplace attitudes have an influence on the uptake of cycling in organisations by attitudes. I don't really mean whether a place has got a shower for somebody to use when they want to change, but it's really around things like the formality of workplaces, whether there's differences between how formal or how informal they are, perceptions around even power in the workplace and hierarchy and also commitment to the organisation, professionalism, things like that, and whether those things are actually different in Denmark to the way they're perceived in the UK.
I usually tell the story that when I was a student at architecture school, I had a fellow study mate from Australia, from Melbourne, who said that when he came to Copenhagen, he would ride his bike in Melbourne, but when he came to Copenhagen, he would ride his bike the same way, and at every intersection, fellow cyclists would tell him that that was not a way to behave when you were cycling, and will you please look at the lights, and will you hold back behind the line, and will you not overtake in that manner, and all this stuff. So educated him slowly, and he found it to be, changing his style, and found it so peaceful and a completely different experience of riding his bike through the city and enjoying it. But then he said he came back to Melbourne to a completely different cycling culture in also where it wasn't laid out for him as a cyclist. And he almost got killed practicing his Copenhagen style. So he had to adapt again back to the Melbourne style. So I think that this is also about that we adapt to what's out there. And that we tend to see in the growing cycling cultures that it is the strong and brave that are out there, and that it is the certain age groups, the certain gender that mainly goes out there. In Australia, they got the mammals, middle-aged men in lycra. So I think people do, as you've been saying, adapt to the environment. But I also think that if you did have a growing, stronger cycling culture, and you do here, that it will change over time. And you will see people riding in their whatever clothes they wear. I think you will also start to see more crappy bikes as we have in Copenhagen. So just a different, more relaxed style and a different thinking around cycling. It's not a big deal. It's just something you do to get from A to B.